Welcome back, everybody. Today we have the great pleasure and honor to host Michael Dunford, visiting professor at the Institute of Geographical Sciences and Natural Resources Research at Chinese Academy of Sciences, and emeritus professor at the School of Global Studies of the University of Sussex. Thank you very much, Michael, for accepting our invitation and to be here with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's actually a great pleasure, a great honor.
Alessandro is freezed. I don't know why, but it's okay. We can hear you, but you are completely freezed, Ale.
Good. But you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Okay.
Good. Okay. So, Michael, in the past few weeks, the three major powers on the planet, Russia, China, and the USA, have publicly announced their idea of a social economic model for the near future. In all three, including Biden's States of Union address, there seemed to be a call to move beyond the era of rhetoric about the minimal state and the omnipotence of market forces, and to return to the state and to its leadership role. Do you think that's just rhetoric, or has something profound changed in the structure of global capitalism?
Okay, can I just make a comment on the structure of global capitalism? I mean, I would rather say...
Sure, please.
I would rather say the structure of global political economy. I suppose I say that, you know, because although capitalism exists in China, I do not consider China a capitalist society or capitalist economy. But that's...
but we completely agree with this. It's just, I mean, it is influenced by the global structure of capitalism. So in that way,
it is influenced. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. It is profoundly influenced. So to answer your question, I mean, I think, yes, some things have changed very radically. I mean, I think the first thing that has changed is that the world's on the verge of a new industrial revolution. So your clean energy, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, robotics, quantum technology, drone technology, life sciences. So that is the first thing. So we're likely to see very radical transformations in economic, political structures, ways of life, you know, in the next 20, 30, 40 years. I think the second point is that past models of development, right, have either lost momentum or they've arrived at a point of crisis. So if you take the neoliberal path, for example, it led to the North Atlantic financial crisis, and it led to secular stagnation in most Western countries, well, in almost all Western countries. In the case of China, the path that it pursued led to, well, first of all, very serious environmental damage. It led to growing inequality. It led to increasing corruption. And it led to growing mass incidents, certainly up to the financial crisis. So China actually started to change path after the Asian financial crisis. And then especially after, you know, what we call the new era, you know, which started really in 2013, when China decided that it would switch to a path of high quality and slower growth under the leadership, essentially, of Xi Jinping. So that, in a sense, represents, to me, a sort of third major phase, you know, in the evolution of China's path to socialism. So that's the second essential problem. But I mean, one can go beyond that, and one can say that specifically in the case of China, the actual drivers of Chinese economic growth also generated a series of serious problems. So, I mean, obviously one is the way in which debt was accumulated in the real estate market, the way in which house prices increased, the way in which insufficient low-income housing was constructed, and the way in which there was an increase in speculation. So that led to a whole series of financial risks, you know, and the government decided to deal with that by establishing these three red lines. And it seems that it's prepared to permit the bankruptcy of some of these large, deeply indebted real estate companies. And it's interesting to reflect on the fact that that path basically dates from reforms in 1998 and then 2003, which to some extent, reflected the recommendations of the World Bank. And I shall come back to that point, probably in relation to one of the other questions that we shall deal with. The second point is that China also had this platform economy, but this platform economy, is associated with very, very high rents, because they basically, people who sell things through these platforms are charged very large sums of money. And much of the content that is provided by these platforms is actually provided by users. So they are enterprises, that are highly monopolistic and that attract huge amounts of funding, and that are also associated with high rents. So to some extent, the growth of that sector has been constrained, by preventing flotations and so on. And then the third area was basically the export economy. The problem with the export economy was that, China was largely processing imported materials and then re-exporting them. And the activities it was involved in were really generally low-skilled, employed unskilled labor, and paid relatively low wages. So, China's goal basically is to see wages increase, but it's also to see the transformation of that sector, essentially to upgrade, to make it green, to make it digital, and so on. So that sector will continue to play a very important role, but quite early, actually, it was decided that upgrading was absolutely vital. And I think the other thing to say about that sector is that, up until 2019, export, trade internationally grew at something like twice the rate of global GDP. But since 2019, the two rates have been about the same. And in the case of China, its export growth was explosive up until really the financial crisis. But then it was relatively high, even in the era after 2013. But once world trade slowed down, that had a significant impact on the performance of the export sector. So, China faces an issue of adapting, finding new growth drivers, and essentially, it's chosen a path of what one might call structural transformation. And I think it's also absolutely clear that markets cannot manage that structural transformation. Markets in any case, they allocate resources in accordance with purchasing power, and they're incapable essentially of distinguishing making judgments on the basis of use value, what's useful as opposed to what's profitable. So China, has always in fact been a kind of plan rational state, in the sense that they identify social and economic objectives, and then they will use market instruments, in order to achieve those particular objectives. And I think you can see that reassertion, if you like, of the importance of the state to some extent in guiding this structural transformation of the Chinese economy. And I was going to say, I find it very, very strange, because Georgieva, the head of the World Bank, came to Beijing recently, and after that she wrote an article, and effectively what she was saying was that China should basically abandon its current course, that it should give more money to consumers, and that it should privatize more of its economy. And I find that astonishing. It comes back to what I said earlier about World Bank advice in relation to the housing market. It was that type of advice that led to the catastrophe in Russia in the 1990s. To some extent, I think, again, it comes back to what has changed. I think in the case of Russia, you see they've, in a sense, regained, a certain degree of control over the economy. The oligarchs, have been placed under much stricter control. And you see quite significant transformations of the Russian economy, it seems, also in the kind of direction that I'm speaking about in the case of China. So that's the second thing. Basically you had these social, environmental inequality problems in China, which led China to change course, but also you had the loss of momentum of some of China's growth drivers, and therefore this switch, if you like, this attempt to put through a kind of supply side structural transformation, reflecting the potential of these technologies of a new industrial revolution, but also to use those technologies to basically upgrade the traditional sectors of the economy and not to abandon them. And then I think the third thing to say is that you've basically seen a dramatic relative decline of the G7 economies. I sent a chart, which shows how the rate of productivity growth, in the G7 countries has basically progressively declined since the 1970s. And you've also then seen the emergence of rival centers of economic power. And I mean, that obviously is leading to significant changes also in the US. I mean, it's reverted to protectionism, and it's obviously putting more emphasis upon these technologies of the future, and perhaps sees itself in technological competition with China. So I think, things have radically changed, basically in terms of, these growth drivers, in terms of the change in the relative weight of different parts of the world, and then also, the significance of this new industrial revolution. It's a long answer. I'm sorry, but
no. It was very clear and useful. Now, I was wondering. I mean, mainly maybe a much bigger change also in the Biden rhetorics, no, in his speech in the State of the Union, no, where we see like this shift. Some people, and I don't agree, but they call like the end of the neoliberal era, no, with the returning of the big state, of the entrepreneurial state, as we call it, like no, Mariana Mazzucato, and talking about this, like taking the kind of our common friend Michael Hudson, no, describe it like fighting the rent to give again to the real economy, the power to grow again. And what was interesting is that Biden has said something also maybe important about some big monopoly, in the U.S. economy that are taking rent from the U.S. economy. For example, big pharma, he has talked about, but he didn't talk a lot about the biggest of all the rent, that is the rent from the financial monopoly, that we see. I mean, do you think that this shift, like let's say a kind of very classic social democratic kind of frame he has pictured in his speech in the State of the Union, is realistic? He can do this without fighting against the financial monopoly, and he has any intention to fight against the financial monopoly, and if he has some intention in this way, he has the strength to do it?
Right. I mean, I'm not an expert on the US, and I do not follow closely what is happening, certainly in terms of United States economic policy. I mean, I've written about the US, and at certain points in time, I've looked relatively closely at its economic development, but I don't follow it on a close day-by-day basis at all. So it's quite difficult, for me to comment on the position that was taken in the State of the Union address. I mean, I would say that there are certain things that are important, and what you just said is amongst the things that are very important. I've already said, that if you look at the whole of the G7, not just the United States, you've seen this progressive decline in productivity growth. And that's basically due to a decline in productive investment, which is precisely, the point that Michael Hudson, the wonderful guy, has made very effectively on many occasions. Very striking also, I sent you a diagram, I mean, if you look at non-financial corporations in the US in 2020, so that's just at the very start of the I think the last data was about 2019 that I looked at. 46% of the assets of the corporate non-financial sector in the United States were financial assets. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. We're not talking about the financial sector. You're talking about the non-financial sector of the US economy, which has to a very significant extent been financialized. So I think that sort of puts in a very, very strong way, the point that you just made, that, I mean, the United States has undergone this extraordinary process of financialization, and that financialization has happened, I think, essentially because of the decline of profitability of real investment. The rate of return on real investments still remains relatively low, and that is a sort of disincentive to undertaking the kind of productive investments that are needed to transform the US economy. But I think certain other things are happening. I think if you look at the way in which the relative strength of different parts of the world is changing, it seems to be clear that if I talk about the collective West, by which I mean, the Europe, the United States, and the parts of the world that were settled by white Europeans, basically, for these parts of the world, there are fewer resources. So the United States seems to be seeking to subordinate Europe in order to seize for itself a much greater share of resources. So, I mean, for example, it's got Europe, to stop purchasing Russian energy and to pay 4 times as much for US liquid natural gas. Is getting European and Taiwanese companies, some of which, in the European case, leave because of the impact on energy costs, to relocate to the United States. So, it's partly trying to strengthen itself by basically pulling resources from its allies, which I find quite, I mean, if I was a European, well, I am a European. I mean, it's something about which I would be deeply concerned, about Europe's loss of strategic autonomy and the way in which it's allowing the United States to appropriate a larger share of resources. And then beyond that, I think even if they want to move into these sectors, in contrast to China, the United States does not have a comprehensive supply chain. It doesn't have many of the skilled work, many of the technical skills, that are needed, simply because of the way in which they allowed themselves to be deindustrialized, through the offshoring of industry, after the 1970s crisis. So, in the practical making of goods and services, they miss, many elements of the supply chain. They may dominate marketing, they may dominate design, they may dominate research and development in certain areas, but in actual manufacture, they lack skills, they lack parts of the supply chain. And also their costs are very high, and their costs are very high precisely because of the rents, that Michael speaks about. If you look at the costs of real estate, if you look at the costs of the health sector and so on. So these things, also make it very, very difficult, for the United States to actually compete in these sectors. So I tend to see, for those reasons, those structural regions, the sort of transition that you're talking about, very, very difficult. But I also very strongly agree with you, that this issue of the role of the financial sector in the United States obviously has to be addressed. It's very striking in the case of China. Xi Jinping repeatedly says, that financial resources should be directed towards the real economy. And that is absolutely vital. And I think a difficulty in the United States is that so many resources are diverted essentially towards financial, real estate, and other related banking sector, and so on.
And that was the other aspect of the 2 sessions contents from the economical point of view that was interesting, because from one side you have, because the US have a lot of weakness, but still have a very strong leadership in some key technological areas, no? And so there is this shift of new productive forces and new technologies, the focus on new productive forces and new technologies from China. But in order to do that, it needs to convince the Chinese people, the Chinese savers, to invest more in that direction, that from the real estate that has been the vast majority of where the vast majority of Chinese money goes till today, no? But at the same time, it still needs, and I want you to explain us why it still needs to focus on quite high percentage of nominal growth, no? Till today for 2024 is 5%. And I mean, penalizing too much the real estate market, it will be a very difficult task to reach, no? So I mean, why do China really need to grow 5% nominally per year in order to have his development and technological independence and everything still working? And if yes, how do you think they will, if they can, how do you think they will find, I mean, do you say a synthesis? It's an English word, synthesis, I don't know, between these two contradictory tasks, growing and taking out the money from the real estate to invest it in the technological independence.
Okay. I mean, I think first, you know, China would say it's seeking a balance between quality and quantity. If I just say two things about this growth rate, I mean, it grew at 5.3% last year. You know, 5% is the target this year. One reason for that target is that if China grows at 5% per year until 2035, it will achieve, doesn't need quite 5%, but you know, it needs to be not far short of 5%. It will achieve one of its long-term targets, which is to double per capita income, real per capita income, by 2035. Okay, so it's first of all, it's a rate that's in line with its long-term, well, medium-term targets. It's also got other targets, you know, that relate to 2049 and so on. The second reason, I think, is that, you know, there's something like 11 million people are going to graduate, you know, from colleges and universities, you know, this year. So they think that they need, you know, it's thought that they need that growth rate essentially to absorb that number of people seeking employment in urban areas. So that's another reason for the growth rate. The growth rate target is linked, you know, to the concern about employment. But, you know, essentially, you know, its priority is this supply side structural transformation, you know, which it plans to achieve through science and technology, research and development, you know, educational reform, you know, because if you look at Li Qiang's government work report, you know, one of the 10 major tasks for next year is linked to the developments in education and linking up, you know, if you like, the profile of skills, you know, with the likely profile of employment. So at the same time, you've got major, you know, very important state industrial policies, and these are one of the issues that you were asking about earlier, about the importance of, you know, Matsukota's arguments, you know, about an entrepreneurial state and about the significance of industrial policy in reshaping the economy. And it's very profoundly related, you know, to this idea of the next, you know, of a new industrial revolution. But as I said, you know, they're also very, you know, the point about innovation is that it has an impact on growth when innovations diffuse. So, for example, you can design, you know, a high-speed train, but what drives growth is when you build, you know, 40,000 kilometers of track and rolling stock for 40,000 kilometers of track. That's what, you know, transforms people's lives and drives development. And so, you know, in thinking about all these new developments associated with the new industrial revolution, also this idea that development should be green, the idea is that these technologies will be used to transform, you know, traditional industries. These traditional industries will then generate employment and play a significant contribution in China's growth. And at the same time, you know, a lot of financial resources are being provided because they plan, you know, to issue something like 1 trillion yuan per year in long-term special treasury bonds, basically to finance the development of these national strategies in what are considered key areas. So this is important, you know, that their fundamental target, you know, is this supply side structural transformation, you know, to enable China to prepare for technological competition. And in many respects, it's very well placed. You know, I mean, short of conflict. And then we talk about the likelihood of conflict if you want, but I mean, just set that aside for the moment. So that's very striking. There's something else that's very interesting about this path, because they use often something that Mao Zedong said long ago, you know, which is that you should establish the new before you destroy the old. And that's quite interesting, you know, because if you think about the way in which in capitalist societies transformation takes place, what happens is you have a crisis in which a lot is destroyed. So you think about the 1930s or the Second World War, or you think about the deindustrialization that occurred in the 1970s and 1980s. And then once that's been destroyed, the new emerges. But in this case, their aim is, you know, if you like, to enable some of the old to continue until the new has been put in place. So I think that's quite striking. I mean, something else that I find striking is that, you know, if you look at the past, the case of Japan, you know, basically, you know, Japan actually reached a point where its GDP per head was quite close to that of the United States. Whereas China today is only about 1/3 of the United States, so there's still a big gap. But at that, you know, at the time of the Plaza Accords, Japan was pressed to increase its exchange rate, but also, you know, to abandon semiconductors, in which, you know, Toshiba, Hitachi, you know, had a significant presence, and also to adopt the path of neoliberalism. And then you saw stagnation set in. And I think if you look at that example, I mean, China is absolutely determined that it should not follow that Japanization path. And, you know, that means, you know, that China, I think, is much likely to
one country that is
Japanizing
is Germany instead, no? Instead of
absolutely, yeah, that is true. And that, I mean, if I were German, you know, I would be deeply concerned. But, you know, if I just come back to this issue of real estate, I mean, I think, you know, the problem in the property sector is basically corporate debt, huge corporate debt. I mean, if you look at Evergrande, you know, which is the one that went into bankruptcy in January, you know, in which the liquidators were called in, the owner, Hui Kai-yen, he's been placed under mandatory measures, you know, which is an important signal. But their conduct was extraordinary. You know, they were paying 10% dividend every year, almost irrespective of circumstances, you know, to their core shareholders. The bankruptcy is interesting because the bankruptcy is linked to their inability to come to an agreement with foreign creditors, because I think there's something like 18 billion owed to foreign creditors, and they failed to come to an agreement. You know, with that debt, a lot of that debt was bought up. You know, that's distressed debt was bought up by Western financial corporations. You know, they were buying that debt at what, I don't know, 15, 20 cents in the dollar. So that attempt to find an agreement seems to have collapsed, basically because they were trying to lay claim to revenues and assets in China. But, you know, what happened in China was that the cash, you know, that was available was used to meet onshore obligations. All the pre-sales revenue was put in custodial accounts. Some local governments, you know, purchased some of the properties that had been finished and then sold them on. So the aim there, you know, is basically because many of those companies, you know, people pay for a house ahead of it being completed, and then those funds were used actually to build the home. So the aim there is to get these houses, you know, that people have partly paid for, you know, completed, and to try to create a more stable housing construction sector. Now, to address the problems, they introduced these 3 red lines, but that was basically to avoid financial risk, because they saw what happened, with the US housing market. I mean, the Chinese one is nowhere near as unstable. You don't see the same degree of change, in house prices and so on as you see in the US, but they were concerned about that. So, that obviously had a very negative impact on the growth of that particular sector. And you're right, it probably, is 24% of GDP by expenditure was the housing market. So that obviously has a negative impact, on China's growth. I mean, in that sense, it's a difficult situation, because there are certain things driving, towards slower growth. At the same time, they want to transfer resources towards these industries of the future, and then to use these industries of the future to transform existing sectors. And I mean, they're quite, they're aware, of the short-term challenges and difficulties. I mean, in a New Year, Xi Jinping gave a speech, and he talked about what he called the tests of the winds and rains. But he said, I'll just quote him. I mean, hold on, I can find it. Okay. He said, when I see people rising to the occasion, reaching out to each other in adversity, meeting challenges head on and overcoming difficulties, I am deeply moved. So it's, he is clear, that there are a lot of Chinese people, who in the current situation confront difficulties. But I mean, what's interesting is, that there seems to be some kind of understanding, that China is moving in the right direction. So I think that is very important. And if you look at Li Chang's work report, in it he envisages a lot of short-term measures, which are designed to address some of these challenges. Some of them, of course, are concerned with short-term employment generation. So 12 million new urban jobs, but I mean, that's partly because I already mentioned, over 11 million people are going to graduate this year. But there's a lot of other initiatives, in terms of the improvement of housing, and provision of services to elderly people, and many other things that are embodied in that work report. So, some resources are being channeled in directions to directly address these short-term difficulties, but the priority, is these new productive forces. China missed out on the last industrial revolution. It adopted, Adam Smith's advice, never produce something if you can buy it more cheaply elsewhere. And then they find that the United States stops them from acquiring these things. So, I think, they're determined, not to miss out on this next industrial revolution. And I think if they join it, I'm sure that, I think they will be successful, and we'll probably see a significant, degree of dynamism in the Chinese economy in the years ahead. As long as they stick to that.
One other obstacle, no? We know that, the welfare, the Chinese welfare is still, it has improved, but it's still backward, no? I want to understand, because when I read this paper from the official government site, I don't remember exactly, when they kind of describe the fact that this speech about, this talk about new productive forces is not just investing in new technologies, it's something also trying to image also a development, a new stage of social, how do you can say, social relation, no? Social productive relation. No? So, it looks like, what I was wondering is that if, for example, in our countries, we are talking about universal minimum salary, no, in order to improve, to facilitate this shift of kind of production, no, and I was wondering if the fact that there is, the Chinese welfare is not very developed, is an obstacle in order to change the productive, the old model, the economic model, or it could also be, a plus, in the sense that because you don't have the old welfare designed on the old industrial kind of model. I mean, you have some advantages, like the latecomer, no? Like, is the latecomer also in the welfare system? I mean, yeah, if you have any idea about this, because I find it quite fascinating, because also for the militaries, we are trying to understand how to be a latecomer and not to have been involved in 30 years of small wars with very asymmetrical powers, no? In some, from some point of view, is an advantage, no? A lot of analysts say this, no? Okay, because the critic is, okay, but they have never fought a war, they don't know how to do it. But some other analysts say, okay, but they were preparing the war that you have to prepare now, while on the contrary, the US have structured their military machine and all for another kind of war, and it's much more difficult to change that than not to starting from scratch, let's say. And also from the welfare system, maybe there is something similar.
Okay, well, on the welfare side, just briefly, you know, China's real GDP per head is 1/3 of the United States and probably about 1/2 of that of the West European, probably most European Union countries. You know, so you're talking about a country whose real GDP is significantly smaller. You know, as far as welfare is concerned, you know, I mean, basically, you know, everyone is housed in one way or another. I mean, you know, 600 million people are still rural. So everyone who is rural, you know, has contracted land, which they can lease to other people now, but it remains their contracted land. They have so-called JGD, you know, so they have a piece of land, you know, on which they can build their own house, and they do build their own houses. And then they also grow their own food. And then you had this extraordinary, you know, poverty program, you know, 2013 to 2020, you know, which lifted well, the remaining, 80 million people, 70 million people over, you know, well over, a long way over, you know, the international poverty line. Now, it's interesting if you look at that program, because, I mean, they, you know, millions, literally, of cadres, government officials, were sent down to the villages, you know, and had to work out, if you like, business plans with these households, you know, because the idea was that anybody, there are subsidies, there are income support payments, but they go to households where people are incapable of work, where no one is capable of work. So there's always this view, you know, that in a socialist society, everyone should contribute where and if they can. Now, this is a difference, I'll come back to that, the difference with Europe. So many of these schemes were basically about ways in which they could use their assets and resources at their distribution to generate incomes for themselves. So that's the first thing, you know, there's this idea that everybody should be active, everyone should contribute insofar as they can, although people, you know, people do retire early. You know, in the early part of the new millennium, they introduced a rural health insurance scheme. It's very, very cheap. And depending on what level of hospital you go to, if you need hospital treatment, you get a very large share reimbursed. But, you know, the other things are expensive. You know, I mean, in China, you know, bringing up children to 18 or even to graduating from university is extremely expensive. It's only more expensive in Korea, you know, in real terms. But then that, you know, Chinese people invest a lot of money in the education of their children. And they also save a lot. And, you know, you have very, very high owner occupancy rate. But, you know, a lot of those houses are not bought with debt, you know, because people save money, you know, and then parents help their children acquire houses. So, you know, you're dealing in a way with a slightly different context. But I mean, it's absolutely clear, you know, that, I mean, there's still considerable scope, you know, for improvements in areas like health, education, other welfare services. If I comment about Europe, you know, I always say, you know, if you go, and I knew something about the UK, you know, if you go back to Keynes and Beveridge, they said the welfare state which is a wonderful thing in principle, really wonderful thing. To give citizenship rights, to health and education, it's really very significant. But they said it depended on two things. It depended on, one, full employment, and it depended, secondly, on cheap housing. I mean, I'm very struck. If you look at the UK today, the amount of money that the government has to spend, paying rents to landlords, so that people don't get thrown onto the streets, is astronomical, because housing is so expensive. Though, I mean, expensive housing is a problem in China as well. So things worked very well, until the 1970s. And then suddenly you see the return of mass unemployment. And it was in that period that you start to see this kind of financialization of the housing market, and housing prices explode, So that makes this kind of welfare system difficult to afford. And I think that's partly why, basically what you're seeing is all these rights pulled back. You're seeing them pulled back. So I'm sure China sees that, and they think, well, we don't want to see the kind of degrees of dependency, that you see in some West European countries, because we want people to be active, to be contributing to society, to be actually working. But that means that there is an obligation that jobs are created. I mean, it's one thing to say everyone should work, but I mean, the problem in Europe is, there are simply not enough jobs for the people who are looking for them, or there are not enough of the right kinds of jobs for people who are looking for them. So you have to generate enough employment. But if the system isn't generating enough decent employment, then it's going to have a problem. And I mean, as I said, Keynes and Beveridge, they saw that absolutely clearly. So this is this is the thing that leads, this kind of erosion of the welfare system, which you see in so many European countries. And I mean, it's really deeply shocking in many ways. So I would say that, on war, let me say this. If you look at, it's very interesting. If you look at Chinese ontology, Chinese thought, it is. You realize we live in a world of multiple civilization. It differs from Western thought in many ways. And, if you look at the Chinese international relations, the central concept is harmony. They have these ideas about tianxia, gongsheng. Gongsheng means symbiosis, you have guanxi, which means relationality. So their view is that you can establish a system in which you can, essentially countries can live in peace. If you listen, when Xi talks about his civilization initiative, his indivisible security initiative, his development initiative, they're all about, essentially creating a kind of harmonious world of mutual cooperation. And if you look at the past, it's fascinating, because I think it was Giovanni Arrighi, but other people have said the same thing, pointed out that China was at peace for 500 years until 1894, virtually, almost. It got pulled into two conflicts between Japan. Japan invaded Korea, two conflicts. And in East Asia, there were a couple of other conflicts involving Myanmar and Thailand. But that was a relatively peaceful part of the world. Whereas then you look at Europe, where we say the 100-year peace, 1814, 1914. But in that period, there were imperial wars all over the globe. So there is something fundamentally different, about these civilizations. And I think if you, obviously, China is not, the leaders are very bright and very capable people, and obviously they're very, very concerned about the threats. And so they're preparing for those threats. But you're right, they've essentially developed in peace, since the Korean War. There was a conflict with Vietnam over Cambodia and Laos, where the Chinese got badly, bruised. But they essentially, probably achieved their goals, because the Vietnamese army at that point in time was very powerful. I think I say those things. I'm not sure if they answered your questions, but
I was wondering that the one thing you didn't answer is about the advantage of being a latecomer in a new
right.
welfare system
Okay.
designed
Yeah.
for a new kind of, for the development of new
Yeah.
productive forces.
Okay. Yeah, that of course is true. Okay. I mean, you know, China doesn't have the kind of incumbent industries, you know, that you find in countries that were earlier to industrialize. So, you know, it is Trotsky, you know, and even combined development, you know, they're the same. You know, it wasn't just China, you know, because the Japan, you know, sort of came later, and so too, well, actually in Europe, so did, you know, I mean, Germany and so on earlier on. So, you know, you've seen many cases where these latecomers, you know, close gaps and, you know, I mean, potentially emerge. I mean, in the case of Germany, you know, it was defeated twice, but I mean, you know, it was potentially, you know, a new global hegemon, you know, at one point in time. And Japan also, you know, but then its growth was essentially stopped. But so, yeah, they have considerable advantage. So, you know, China almost jumps straight into some era, the modern, you know, telecommunications era, you know, because its existing incumbent infrastructure was relatively weak. Its rail infrastructure existed, but was relatively weak, but it jumps into the world of high-speed rail and builds, you know, what, 40,000 kilometers of track, which is astonishing, you know, and the rolling stock, you know, for regular services. So that is clear, you know, that but I still think it's interesting, this notion that you build the new, you know, because they still think you've got to build the new, right? At every point in time, you know, you've got to build the new, and you try to build the new without scrapping the old first, and maybe by kind of transforming the old, you know. I said in relation to traditional industries, you know, making them greener, bringing in digital technologies, you know, raising skill profiles, introducing robots and so on. So these are clear, you know, clear advantages in many ways. But I mean, also there are obstacles, you know, because the leaders, you know, will want to limit, you know, the rise of potential rivals, at least in a world. Well, I mean, that's not the Chinese view, you know, because you know, the Chinese view is that if you help others get richer, that you will get richer yourself. You know, that actually it's these things are mutually beneficial. You know, you don't have to have a kind of zero-sum situation where one wins and the other loses. But I think, you know, the world that we've lived in, you know, maybe 500, well, we haven't lived in it, but, you know, the world of the last 500 years has been one in which, you know, some people have won and others have lost, you know, so
yeah, one last question is, I mean, now there's this point from me, and then Alessandro, if you have some other question, and that now the main focus in Europe and in the US is not this idea of the overproduction from China, and that is invading our markets, no? I mean, some signal is already there because, for example, from the point of view of the production of photovoltaic panels, it looks like quite true, no? That there is an overproduction compared at least to the rate we are trying to convert our energy production to renewable sources, no? And also there is the big problem of the automotive sector with the Chinese superpower in the new electric vehicles. I mean, is it true that there is a structural overproduction problem coming from China for our markets, or it is overrated?
I would have thought, if you're talking about photovoltaic panels, you know, that Europe buys what it needs. All right? I mean, if there's overproduction, you know, I mean, if China is producing more than people want to sell, then I would imagine, you know, the prices will fall. You know, but I mean, you know, if Europe only needs to purchase what it actually needs, so, you know, in what sense is, I mean, in relation to vehicles, I can see, there's obviously an issue, because I mean, a country like Germany has had a very powerful, motor vehicle industry. And it's quite, if you look at China, in a sense, they made a mistake because they basically handed over their entire market, to Western motor vehicle manufacturers. So you basically didn't have a Chinese motor car manufacturer of any significance. But of course it's changed, because of electric vehicles. So in relation to electric vehicles, I guess it's a problem of competition, so when they say overproduction, I mean, are they referring to the fact that, they've got competition from China, which is sort of squeezing, potential European producers out of the market? Well, I mean, if that's the case, then, it's a matter for Europe basically trying to manage this relationship. I mean, this is, so I think I would react in that way, probably. It's, I mean, China says that it's going to open up its own market more, internationally. So, but I mean, these things, I suppose, partly emerge through, sort of differences in, the competitiveness of different countries. Did China, after the the financial crisis, then you saw this 4 trillion was it, fiscal boost, to deal with the repercussions of the financial crisis, and then there were massive infrastructure investments in China, which were really important. You can't say they were not important, because if you put basically high-speed internet into every administrative village and connect every natural village, with the internet, suddenly you open up all sorts of possibilities for these people living in these places, and that had a lot to do, the existence of that infrastructure had a lot to do with the success of this poverty alleviation program, which was working in areas, that are basically mountainous, that are ecologically fragile and so on. So it was very, very, very striking. But, at the end of that, there was a lot of excess capacity in certain sectors. And it would include in some of these infrastructural sectors. But I mean, China has undertaken massive infrastructure, it's that financed and undertaken massive infrastructural investment in African countries, in Belt and Road countries. So you could say, yeah, okay, China there had excess capacity, but it's actually found ways of absorbing that capacity basically through funding, these infrastructure projects in developing countries. But I mean, these infrastructure projects, have potentially positive consequences for the economic growth of these countries. And if they don't want them, they don't have to, they don't have to accept them. They're not being compelled, to accept them. So, I haven't been to Europe for a few years, and I haven't read too much about what they say in the media about Chinese competition. But
if they invest a little bit more of their huge profit of the last 2 years, maybe
well, the rate of investment.
better.
Well, I mean, the point is, I mean, Europe has to invest in its industries and in industries of the future, and it has to direct its financial resources towards these industries to create employment, income, and probably also, to transform many of its services. So, but that means. That means a radical sort of political and economic transformation of Europe, because I see, if I look at the EU, I mean, it basically seems to still be attached to this kind of neoliberal, anti-statist agenda, which I think does not serve Europe well. Does not serve Europe well at all.
Ale, do you have some questions, and then we close?
Yeah, just a very, very brief one. I just was wondering if, since your direct experience in China and with Chinese universities, if the mainstream thoughts about everything we've talked about in this conversation is close to to your analysis, or it's very different. I mean, on the global economy and on the relationship with the USA? I mean, I know it's very hard question, but since your experience, do you think that's it's the same? It's the same. It's the same close to our analysis what they are thinking there or not?
It's quite a difficult question to answer. You know, I know a lot of people whose position is very similar, you know, to what I just said. I think you can read what the government says, and quite a lot of things that I've said are things that you can see and read in government documents. So, you know, in many respects, I think it's quite close to government positions. So those two things. If you go into universities, you go into economics departments, or you know, I mean, there are a lot of people who are essentially liberal. You know, they were educated in Western countries in many cases. You know, what they teach, you know, is Western economics. So you know, some of those people will probably be more critical. On the other hand, you know, I just think of someone, you know, one of China's leading economists, you know, recently wrote an article about China's current position that actually really quite surprised me. You know, in the past, what he argued, you know, was that he was very critical of the first 30 years. You know, and he thought that with reform and opening up, China adopted a sensible path because it specialized in unskilled labor-intensive industries that reflected its comparative advantage. This was the story. Okay, and you know, with a very strong commitment, you know, to market allocation. But he's just written an article about, I don't know, it's a lecture he gave. I think it was one of the last lectures he gave to his students, you know, in Beidar. And what you've got in there is a very strong advocacy of industrial policy and of the kind of top-down transformation that is going ahead at the moment. Now, I remember maybe about 15 years ago, I saw this conversation between him and, you know, an economist at Cambridge, Korean economist, you know, who wrote a lot about Cho Yoon-han, who wrote a lot about the Korean developmental state. And at that point, you know, this Chinese economist basically disagreed quite strongly with him about industrial policy. So I think, you know, that in these circumstances, you see, you know, quite a lot of people sort of moving. And I think, you know, I suspect also, you know, the international context, the kind of way in which, you know, the United States is conducting itself in relation to China, that if you talk about ordinary people, you know, it's you know, just the common people, you know, they are overwhelmingly supportive of the government, overwhelmingly, you know, this kind of, but there is a kind of liberal intelligentsia. But I think you see movement there. But you'll still find you will still, you can still read them, you know, you can publish things, you know. There are people who are critical, but I mean, I don't share those views, but I mean, they have views that are very similar, you know, to the kind of views of the sort of Western liberal critics of China. No. Sure. But
thank you very much, Michael, for this this conversation. We hope that we'll have other opportunities.
Yeah, well, it's really nice to speak to you, and I mean, it's great to be in contact with you. So, I mean, you know, do keep in touch. And if, you know, sure, there are interesting things on Italy, I wrote a book about Italy. I can't remember. I mean, it was published in about 2006. You know, it's more about the kind of, you know, north-south, Italy, Italia, these issues about regional economics. But,
that's, you know, very interesting, absolutely.
Yeah.
I didn't know you wrote a book about Italy.
I do. I've been interested in Italy for quite a long time, and I said it's a country that I really you know, like very much indeed, you know, and its people. So yeah, no, at that time I went quite often, and I did quite a lot of field work and so on, and so you know, I ought to catch up, you know.
That's great. That's great.
Come here, you know. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mick. Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care.
Bye, Michael, and bye to everybody.
Okay, bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.